The sound of crystal shattering against bone is a sound you never forget. It is not the clean, almost musical chime of a dropped glass on a tile floor. It is a dull, wet thud, followed by a splintering crack that echoes in the sudden, deafening silence. In that silence, you can hear a heartbeat. Mine, thudding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. You can hear a sharp, horrified gasp. My son's, a sound ripped from his very soul. And you can hear the ragged, shallow breaths of the person who threw the glass. My daughter-in-law, Carly. Her arm was still extended, a grotesque sculpture of fury, her fingers curled around the ghost of the weapon she had just launched at my face. The wine, a deep crimson Cabernet, dripped from my hair down my temple and mingled with the warmer, thicker crimson of my own blood. It felt like hot tears. "You, worthless old hag," she shrieked, her voice a raw slash in the fragile quiet of my dining room. "When I tell you to pour more wine, you obey." Her words stumbled out, slurred by the alcohol that had fueled this monstrous transformation. She swayed on her feet, a marionette whose strings had been cut, held up only by the sheer force of her rage. In that moment, as the first drop of blood traced a path down my cheek, something inside me did not snap. It did not break. It solidified. It hardened from a molten core of shock and pain into something cold, clear, and unyielding. For 30 years, I sat on a bench in a courtroom, wearing a black robe and wielding the power of the law. I had looked into the eyes of murderers, thieves, and con artists. I had listened to their lies, weighed their actions, and delivered their consequences. I was Judge Elena Miller, retired, but a judge nonetheless. The courtroom had taught me that emotion is a storm, but the law is a bedrock. And as I stood there, bleeding in my own home, I knew with a chilling certainty that I was no longer just a mother-in-law in a family dispute. I was a victim, and I was about to build a case. A case that would show my daughter-in-law, my son, and the world exactly who held the power in this house. The law was my language, and I was about to become fluent once more. The evening had not begun with such violence. It had begun, as most Friday nights did, with a quiet and deliberate sense of order. 6 months ago, my son Andy and his wife Carly had moved into my home. The reason they gave was a familiar one, a story told by countless young couples in a difficult economy. They were saving for a down payment on a house of their own. They just needed a little time, a little help to get on their feet. I, of course, had agreed. This house, with its echoing hallways and empty rooms, had felt too large since my husband passed away 5 years prior. The thought of having my son back under my roof, of hearing his laughter in the living room, was a comfort I had craved. 6 months later, the laughter was infrequent, and they were still here. The little time they needed seemed to stretch into an indefinite horizon. Tonight, I had spent hours preparing a prime rib roast, letting it cook low and slow until the meat was tender enough to fall from the bone. The aroma of rosemary and garlic filled the house, a scent I associated with warmth and family. I set the dining table with my best china, the plates edged with a delicate gold filigree that had been my mother's. The crystal wine glasses, a wedding gift from my own grandmother, shimmered under the warm glow of the chandelier. These rituals, these small formalities were important to me. They were the anchors of a civilized life. After 3 decades of witnessing the chaos and depravity of the criminal world, routine and order were the pillars that held up my sanity. They were a reminder that beauty and grace still existed. Carly arrived home at precisely 7:30 p.m., already a storm cloud on the serene landscape of my evening. She burst through the front door, not walking so much as conquering the space. She tossed her designer purse onto the antique sofa with a careless thud that made me wince internally. Without a word of greeting, she marched directly to the mahogany bar cart in the corner of the living room. Her movements were sharp, agitated. She seized a bottle of red wine, the same expensive Cabernet she would later use as a weapon, and poured a heavy measure into one of my grandmother's glasses. "That idiot boss of mine," she began, her voice tight with resentment as she spoke to the room at large. "He thinks he can just keep piling on the pressure. He made me redo the entire quarterly report. Said it was missing critical details. The man wouldn't know a critical detail if it bit him on his overpaid backside." She downed the entire glass in 3 large, unladylike gulps, her throat working. Then she poured another, just as full, before she had even taken a seat at the meticulously set table. Across the room, Andy caught my eye. He offered a small, apologetic grimace, a silent plea for my patience that had become his primary mode of communication regarding his wife. My son. He had always been this way, a gentle soul caught in the crossfire, a peacekeeper who so desperately avoided confrontation that he often sacrificed his own peace in the process. He busied himself helping me bring the serving dishes from the kitchen, his presence a quiet counterpoint to Carly's grating energy. During dinner, I tried to steer the conversation into calmer waters. I asked Andy about his work at the veterinary clinic, about a particularly challenging surgery he had performed on a golden retriever. I spoke about the new biography I was reading on Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, hoping to find some common ground of intellectual curiosity. I did anything I could to dilute the palpable tension that radiated from Carly in waves, but every attempt at civilized discourse was met with a cynical torpedo. When I spoke of the book, she rolled her eyes. "Oh, please," another old feminist telling us how to live. When Andy spoke of his work, she scoffed. "Still playing with puppies and kittens all day? Must be nice to have a job that doesn't matter." With every sarcastic interruption, with every dismissive gesture, she drank more wine. Her glass was a perpetual motion machine, constantly being emptied and extended for more. The first bottle disappeared, then the second. By the time we were halfway through the third, I knew the evening had crossed a line. The pleasant dinner I had envisioned had devolved into a hostage situation, and I was no longer willing to be a captive at my own table. Carly held out her empty glass in my direction, not with a request, but with an entitled flick of the wrist, as if I were a waitress in a roadside diner and not the owner of the house that sheltered her. A quiet resolve settled over me. "I think you have had enough for today, Carly," I said. My voice was not loud, but it was firm, cutting through her drunken haze with the precision of a scalpel. She froze, the glass still held aloft. Her eyes, glassy and unfocused, fixed on me. She stared as if I had suddenly started speaking in a foreign language she could not comprehend. "What did you just say?" she whispered, her voice dangerously low. I met her gaze without flinching. I said, "You have had enough. This is my house, and I will not permit you to become disgustingly intoxicated at my table." It was like striking a match in a room filled with gas fumes. The explosion was instantaneous. Her face, already flushed from the wine, turned a deep, mottled crimson. A fury, so potent and so raw, erupted from her. A rage that had clearly been simmering just beneath the surface for months, perhaps for the entire duration of her stay. "Your house?" She laughed, a bitter, grating sound that scraped the air. "Just because we're forced to live in this dusty old museum with you doesn't mean you get to treat us like children." Andy, ever the diplomat, reached for her arm. "Carly, please. Don't." She wrenched her arm away from his touch with a violent jerk. "No, Andy. I am sick of this. I am sick of her. Your mother looks at us like we're intruders, like we're not worthy of walking on her precious polished hardwood floors." She turned her full venomous attention back to me, her body coiled like a snake ready to strike. "You know what your problem is, Elena? You can't stand the fact that you're not the all-powerful Judge Miller anymore. Now you're just a lonely, retired old woman who has to control every little thing and everyone around her just to feel a sliver of importance." I remained perfectly still. Years on the bench had taught me the art of the poker face, the discipline of never letting a prosecutor or a defense attorney see how their words landed. I would not give her the satisfaction of a reaction. "If that is truly how you feel," I said, my voice as cold and calm as a winter morning, "then perhaps it is time you and Andy found another place to live." "Mom." Andy's voice was a cry of anguish, horrified that I had finally spoken the unspoken. But Carly just smiled. It was a terrifying smile, one that did not touch her eyes. It was the smile of a predator cornered, all teeth and no warmth. "Servants shouldn't talk back to their masters," she sneered. She held out the glass again, thrusting it towards me with renewed aggression. "Now, more, wine." "No," I said. It was the only word I needed, and it was my last. The movement was a blur. Faster than I could process, faster than I could raise a hand to defend myself. One moment the glass was in her hand, the next it was flying through the air, a crystal missile on a direct and deadly trajectory for my face. The impact on my right temple was a sickening shock, a burst of white-hot pain that radiated through my skull. Then came the sound, that awful, wet crack. as the crystal shattered against me. I felt the sharp sting of the shard slicing into my skin, and then an immediate, spreading warmth as blood began to flow freely. My son's scream was primal. It was the sound of a child seeing his world break apart. Carly stood frozen, her chest heaving, her eyes wide, as if she herself were surprised by the violence she had just unleashed. But there was no remorse in her expression. There was only a wild, triumphant blaze. I slowly raised my hand to my temple, my fingers coming away slick and stained with a shocking, vibrant red. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound, thick with the consequences of what had just happened. 30 years of sending violent criminals to prison, and here I was, bleeding at my own dining room table, the victim of an assault by my own family. My mind, trained by decades of crisis and calculation, began to work. "Andy," I said, my voice betraying none of the tremor I felt inside. It was the calm voice of judicial authority. "Take your wife to her room, now." For a moment, Andy was paralyzed, his eyes darting between my bleeding face and his stunned wife. Then, his survival instincts kicked in. He rushed to Carly, grabbing her arm and pulling her, stumbling and unresisting, out of the dining room. I heard their footsteps pounding up the grand staircase, followed by the definitive slam of a bedroom door. Alone at last, I took a deep, shuddering breath. The adrenaline was beginning to fade, leaving behind a throbbing, insistent pain. I walked not to the medicine cabinet but to the downstairs bathroom. I needed to assess the damage. In the stark light of the vanity mirror, the injury looked worse than it felt. It was not a deep gash, but head wounds always bleed profusely. As I carefully cleaned the cut with cold water and a soft cloth, my thoughts began to arrange themselves, not in a panic, but in a logical, orderly sequence. A prosecutor preparing a case, a judge reviewing evidence. I walked back to the dining room. My cell phone felt cool and steady in my hand. I began to document everything. I took a photograph of the cut on my temple, swollen and angry. I photographed the blood stain blossoming on the collar of my white silk blouse. I photographed the glittering sea of glass shards scattered across the antique Persian rug and the polished floor. Then, with the meticulous care of a crime scene technician, I collected every single fragment of that shattered glass. I placed each piece into a clear plastic bag, the kind used for evidence preservation. Evidence, that was the key. 30 years in the justice system had taught me one irrefutable truth. Evidence is everything. It does not have emotions. It does not lie. That night, sleep was an impossibility. I sat in my leather office chair, an ice pack pressed against my throbbing temple, the low lamplight glinting off the law books that lined my walls. I did not plot revenge. Revenge is a messy, emotional, and ultimately unsatisfying pursuit. What I needed was not revenge, it was justice. It was the cold, clean, and methodical application of the law. I needed to protect myself, my home, and most importantly, I needed to protect my son from the monster he had married. At 6 minutes past midnight, with the skin around my wound already blooming into a dark purplish bruise, I picked up the telephone and dialed 3 numbers that I knew by heart. The voice on the other end was professional and detached. "Miami Police Department. How can I help you?" I took a steadying breath. "I would like to report an assault." The police officer arrived at 7:30 in the morning. The early sun was just beginning to slice through the cracks in the living room curtains, painting stripes of light across the floor. Upstairs, Andy and Carly were still asleep, lost in the heavy, oblivious slumber that follows a night of emotional and alcoholic explosion. I opened the front door to a man in his late 40s, his uniform crisp, his hair showing the first distinguished flecks of gray at the temples. He had a weary but kind face, the face of a man who had seen too much. "Good morning, ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I'm Officer Davis. I received a call about a possible assault." I invited him in, my home feeling strangely foreign, now officially a crime scene. I led him to the dining room. The evidence of the previous night's violence was still there, undisturbed. The blood-stained napkin I had used, the faint smell of spilled wine, and in a corner, the clear plastic bag filled with the fragments of my grandmother's crystal glass. To add a touch of professional gravity, I had even used small numbered labels I kept in my office to mark where the largest pieces had landed. I had spent my sleepless hours preparing not just my mind, but the scene itself. It happened right here, I explained. My voice kept low so as not to wake the aggressor sleeping soundly in my guest room. My daughter-in-law threw this glass at my face when I refused to serve her any more wine. She had already consumed an excessive amount of alcohol. I showed him the photographs on my cell phone, swiping through them with a steady hand. The cut, the blood on my blouse, the shattered remnants. Officer Davis observed everything with a professional, non-judgmental expression, meticulously writing notes in a small, worn spiral notebook. His pen scratched quietly in the silent house. "Is the alleged assailant still in the residence?" he asked, his eyes meeting mine. "Yes," I replied. "She is sleeping upstairs, with my son." He paused for a beat, letting the weight of that statement settle. "Do you wish to file a formal complaint, ma'am?" I hesitated, but only for a fraction of a second. An image of Andy's horrified face flashed through my mind, a pang of motherly guilt twisting in my gut. But then, it was replaced by another image, the look in Carly's eyes as she threw the glass. It was a look of pure, unadulterated entitlement, the absolute certainty that she could assault me in my own home and face no consequences. That was the image that sealed her fate. "Yes, officer," I said, my voice clear and resolute. "I wish to file a formal complaint." We sat at my sturdy oak kitchen table, the same table where Andy had done his homework as a boy, while Officer Davis filled out the official police report. He asked for the aggressor's full name, our relationship, and a detailed chronological description of the events. I provided the information with the same dispassionate clarity I once used to dictate court sentences. My tone was precise, devoid of any visible emotion. I was no longer a mother-in-law. I was the primary witness for the prosecution. We were just finishing up, the officer reviewing the final details, when the floorboards on the staircase creaked. Andy appeared in the kitchen doorway, his eyes puffy and swollen with sleep. His expression shifted in an instant from groggy confusion to wide-eyed horror as he took in the scene, his mother with a bruised and cut temple and a uniformed police officer sitting at his kitchen table. "Mom, what is going on?" Before I could formulate a reply, Carly appeared behind him, a shadow in his wake. Her initial confusion also morphed, but not into horror. It twisted into a mask of pure, defiant anger as her gaze fell upon my injury and then to the policeman. "What the hell is this?" she demanded, her voice raspy with sleep and residual fury. Officer Davis stood up slowly, his presence filling the room. "Mrs. Carly Miller? I'm Officer Davis with the Miami Police Department. I am here to investigate a complaint of assault that occurred at this residence last night." Andy's head whipped back towards me, his eyes filled with disbelief and betrayal. "You called the police? On Carly?" I met his gaze, my own unwavering. "She assaulted me, Andy. She threw a glass at my face and cut me. I will not tolerate violence in my home." My voice remained firm, unapologetic. "It was an accident. She was drunk," Andy protested, his voice cracking with desperation. "Being intoxicated is not a legally valid defense for physical assault, sir," Officer Davis commented dryly, his tone professional but undeniably firm. Carly stepped forward, her hands clenched into tight fists at her sides. "You can't be serious. This is ridiculous. It was a family argument." "A family argument that resulted in a physical injury," I countered calmly, "and in my own home." The officer turned his attention back to Carly. "Ma'am, for now I need to ask you to accompany me to the station to provide a statement." "What?" she shrieked, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch. "You're going to arrest me over a broken glass?" "At this moment I am only requesting that you provide a statement," Officer Davis clarified patiently, though a flicker of annoyance crossed his face. "Depending on the confirmed facts of the investigation, you could be charged with battery." Andy was crying now, silent tears streaming down his face as he looked back and forth between me, the officer, and his wife, a man caught in an impossible emotional vice. "Please, Mom, don't do this," he begged, his voice a choked whisper. "We can solve this. In the family." I looked at my son, at the raw pain etched on his features, and I felt a pang so sharp it had nothing to do with the cut on my temple. It was the pain of a mother seeing her child choose his own destruction. "Andy, we have tried to resolve this in the family for 6 months, I said, my voice softening slightly but losing none of its resolve. "Last night, Carly crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. Officer Davis instructed Carly to go upstairs and get dressed appropriately to accompany him. She stomped up the stairs like a petulant teenager, a whirlwind of furious energy. Andy trailed behind her, his shoulders slumped in defeat, still muttering pleas for her to calm down. For a few minutes I was left alone with the officer. He looked at me with an expression I recognized well from my years on the bench. It was the look veteran cops get when they are trying to quickly assess the complex, messy dynamics of a family in crisis. "Ma'am," he began gently, "are you absolutely sure you want to go through with this? Family matters can sometimes be." I interrupted him, politely but firmly. "Officer, I was a criminal court judge for 30 years. I presided over thousands of cases, many of them far more tragic than this. I know exactly what I am doing, and I am fully aware of the legal consequences that will follow." His eyebrows shot up in surprise. The weariness in his eyes was replaced by a newfound respect. He gave a single, decisive nod. "Understood, Your Honor," he said quietly. Carly came back downstairs dressed in jeans and a t-shirt, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She looked less like a professional woman and more like a cornered animal. Andy followed her like a somber shadow, his silent tears now replaced by a look of grim resignation. As she passed me on her way to the door, she leaned in close, her voice a venomous whisper. "This isn't over. You are going to regret this." Officer Davis, overhearing her, immediately cautioned her, "Ma'am, I would strongly advise you not to make threats." His warning only seemed to fuel her rage, a low growl rumbling in her chest. As the officer led her out to the patrol car, Andy turned to me, his eyes red and accusing. "How could you do this to us?" "She's my wife, and I am your mother," I answered simply, my voice heavy with a sorrow he could not yet understand. "And this is my house." The front door clicked shut, and the house was plunged back into silence. Andy stared at me for a long, painful moment, his expression one of utter incomprehension, as if he were looking at a stranger. Then, without another word, he turned and ran back up the stairs. A moment later, I heard his bedroom door slam shut with a finality that broke my heart. I sank into my favorite armchair in the living room, a sudden and profound exhaustion washing over me. The bruise on my temple throbbed, a dull, rhythmic ache. But the physical pain was a welcome distraction from the agonizing pain of my son's betrayal and disillusionment. Still, I had no regrets. The courtroom had taught me many hard lessons, and one of them was this: justice, when it is being applied, rarely feels fair or comfortable to everyone involved. It is a necessary and often painful recalibration of the scales. 2 hours later, Andy came downstairs. He carried a backpack slung over one shoulder and had a look of grim determination on his face, though his eyes were still puffy from crying. "I'm going to the station to pick up Carly," he announced, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "We'll stay at Patty's place for a while, until we figure out what to do." Patty was a friend of theirs, a young woman who lived in a tiny, overpriced apartment downtown. It was a temporary refuge at best, and we both knew it. "Andy," I began, trying to keep my voice gentle, "you don't have to leave. This is your home, too." He let out a short, bitter laugh that held no humor. "This house stopped being my home the moment you decided to call the police on my wife." "She assaulted me, Andy," I repeated, my patience wearing thin, "at my own dining room table, in front of you." "She was drunk. She lost her temper. People make mistakes," he shot back, his voice rising. "And people need to be held accountable for their mistakes," I replied, my own voice now firmer, the judge resurfacing. "Especially when those mistakes involve physical violence." Andy just shook his head, a look of deep disappointment on his face. "It's always been this way with you, hasn't it? The inflexible judge, the law above everything, even above your own family, even above your own son." That accusation struck me harder than the glass had. It was a direct hit to the heart, but I refused to let him see me bleed. "It is because I love you that I am doing this, Andy," I said, my voice low and earnest. "Carly is abusive, and you are trapped in a destructive relationship. Don't you dare stand there and analyze my marriage," he seethed. "You've never liked Carly. You've always thought I deserved someone better." "And you do," I said quietly, with absolute conviction. "You deserve someone who respects you, and who respects your family." He snatched his car keys from the coffee table, the metallic jingle sounding unnaturally loud in the tense silence. "I'm going to get my wife," he said, turning his back to me. "Then we'll be back for the rest of our things." The front door closed behind him, and this time, the silence that descended upon the house was different. It was not the peaceful silence I so cherished. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, laden with unspoken words and irrevocable consequences. I spent the rest of that day in a state of suspended animation, my mind a pendulum swinging between doubt and certainty. Had I done the right thing? Or had I just pushed my only son away forever? The questions echoed in the empty rooms as I tried to read, tried to eat, tried to distract myself from the gaping wound in my family. That evening, the phone rang, startling me. It was Andy. His voice was cold, distant, a stranger's voice. "We're at Patty's. The police released Carly with a summons to appear at a hearing next week. Andy, you don't have to." I started. "We'll be by tomorrow to get our things," he interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I've made my decision, Mom. I choose to stand by my wife." He hung up before I could say another word. The dial tone buzzed in my ear. A lonely, monotonous sound. I sat there in the dark for a long time. Then, I walked to my office, turned on my computer, and created a new folder on the desktop. I named it Case Carly. Inside, I created a series of documents, ready to record every stage of the legal process, every conversation, every piece of evidence I had collected and would continue to collect. For 3 decades, I had built cases against criminals of every stripe. Now, I was building a case to save my son from a toxic marriage, even if he hated me for it. The law was all I had left. The next morning, as I waited for the inevitable arrival of Andy and Carly, I made another phone call. This one was to an old friend. Rick and I had worked together for years at the courthouse, he as a sharp, tenacious detective, and I as the judge who often presided over the cases his investigations brought to light. He had retired a few years before I did, and now ran a small but highly respected private investigation agency. His deep, gravelly voice was an instant comfort. "Ellie, is that you? It's been too long. To what do I owe the honor?" "I need your help, Rick," I said, skipping the pleasantries. "It's a delicate family matter." I explained the entire situation, the assault, the police report, the profound rift with Andy. "I have a terrible feeling about her, Rick. Something is not right. I need to know more about Carly, about her finances, about her past, about how they're really living." Rick, true to form, didn't ask unnecessary questions. He understood the subtext. He knew this was more than a mother-in-law's dislike. This was a judge's intuition screaming that something was fundamentally wrong. "Send me all her details, Ellie. I'll start digging, discreetly." An hour later, I parked my car 2 blocks away from my own house in a spot that gave me a clear, unobtrusive view of the front door. I did not want to be there when they arrived. A direct confrontation would only escalate the situation and drive Andy further away. From my vantage point, I watched my son's car pull into the driveway. I saw him and Carly get out. Andy moved with a heavy reluctance, while Carly's movements were sharp and angry. They used the key Andy still had to let themselves into my home. For nearly 2 hours, I sat in my car, a silent sentinel watching my life being packed into boxes. I saw their silhouettes pass by the windows, carrying clothes, books, and other personal effects. When they finally emerged, the car was loaded down. Before getting into the driver's seat, Andy stood on the lawn and looked at the house, his house, for a long moment. Even from a distance, I could see the grief on his face. He was mourning the life he thought he had. Carly, on the other hand, got into the passenger seat and immediately started talking, her hands gesticulating wildly. She was already poisoning him further against me. I was sure of it. I waited another 20 minutes after they drove away before I returned. The absence they left behind was a physical presence. It was in the empty spaces on the bookshelves, the silence in the hallways. The guest room they had occupied was stark and impersonal. They had left the furniture, of course, but all traces of their life there were gone. As I was closing the closet door, my eyes caught a small, empty velvet box on the shelf. My heart sank. A gold brooch, an heirloom that had belonged to my mother, was missing. Andy knew how much that brooch meant to me. Was its disappearance an oversight in their hasty packing? Or was it a small, deliberate act of revenge, a final twist of the knife? I chose, for my own sanity, to believe it was the former. The days that followed were suffocatingly quiet. Andy did not call. He did not respond to my texts. I gave him the space he so clearly wanted, but each passing day without contact felt like a small, personal torture. On Wednesday afternoon, an email arrived from Rick. It was his preliminary report. I opened the encrypted attachment with a sense of trepidation, my heart pounding in my chest. The findings were far worse than I could have possibly imagined. Carly had not been having problems with her boss. She had been fired from her marketing job 3 months ago for poor performance and suspected expense account fraud. She had been lying to everyone, including her own husband, about going to work every day. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. The report detailed 5 active credit cards in her name, all of them maxed out, accumulating a staggering debt of nearly $80,000. Worse, 2 of those cards were in Andy's name. Cards he had no knowledge of. She must have opened them using his social security number, forging his signature on the applications. The next page of the report made me feel physically ill. Rick had uncovered 3 significant withdrawals from Andy's retirement account over the past 2 months. The total amount withdrawn was $40,000. His entire nest egg gone. To access those funds, she would have needed his passwords, his security information. She had systematically and secretly plundered their future. And there was more, a string of small complaints from local stores for bounced checks. An eviction notice from a previous apartment they had lived in before moving in with me, a detail they had conveniently failed to mention. And then, the most chilling discovery of all. Rick had found conversations on her social media, messages to friends where she joked darkly about her living situation. "Just have to put up with the old lady for a few more months," one message read. "Then, when she finally bites the dust, we'll inherit the house, and all our financial problems will be solved." The old lady. That was me. A wave of nausea washed over me. This was not just a case of a bad temper or a disrespectful daughter-in-law. This was a calculated, predatory scheme. Carly was a parasite, slowly draining my son of his financial lifeblood, while callously waiting for me to die. I printed the entire report, my hands shaking slightly. I placed it in the Case Carly folder. This was no longer just about an assault. It was about fraud, identity theft, and a level of cold-blooded manipulation that bordered on sociopathic. I called Rick again. "I need you to keep digging, Rick. I need concrete proof that she made those withdrawals without Andy's authorization. We could be looking at serious financial crimes here." "I'm on it, Ellie," he said, his voice grim. "And listen, be careful. A woman this desperate, who thinks she has an inheritance on the line, well, people do crazy things." He didn't need to finish the sentence. I knew. 30 years in the criminal justice system had taught me that money is the most powerful motivator for the most desperate of acts. That evening, I called a locksmith and had every lock on my house changed. It was a necessary precaution. The fortress was now secure. The following week brought the preliminary hearing for the assault charge. I walked into the courthouse, a building where I had spent the better part of my adult life, and for the first time, I felt like a stranger. It was a profoundly disorienting experience to be on the other side of the proceedings, to sit in the gallery as a victim. Former colleagues, lawyers, and bailiffs and clerks greeted me with looks of concern and curiosity, their whispers following me down the hallway. Carly arrived with a public defender, a young man in an ill-fitting suit who looked like he was barely out of law school. To my surprise, Andy was not with her. I had expected him to be there, a pillar of support for his embattled wife. His absence was a small, hopeful sign that perhaps, just perhaps, some cracks were beginning to form in his wall of denial. The judge assigned to the case was Sarah Jennings, a sharp, competent woman I had known professionally in my final years on the bench. She saw me in the gallery and gave a subtle, respectful nod in my direction. The proceedings were brief and straightforward. The prosecutor presented the charge of misdemeanor battery. Carly's lawyer argued that it was a regrettable, isolated incident fueled by stress and alcohol with no malicious intent. "Your Honor," he said, his voice earnest, "my client has no prior criminal record and is deeply remorseful for her actions. We request that the court consider an alternative to incarceration, such as community service and anger management. When it was my turn to give a victim's impact statement, I stood and walked to the podium. I stood with the same posture I had maintained for decades, my back straight, my voice steady. "Your Honor," I began, addressing Judge Jennings directly. "I do not seek revenge or a harsh punishment for the defendant. I seek justice, and more importantly, I seek protection. This assault occurred in my own home, at my own dinner table, perpetrated by someone I had welcomed and sheltered out of love for my son. I respectfully request that, in addition to any punitive measures the court deems appropriate, a restraining order be issued, prohibiting the defendant from coming near my residence or my person." I saw Carly's face go pale. A restraining order. It was a legal barrier, a definitive line she could not cross. It meant she could not return to my house, the house she apparently hoped to inherit one day. Judge Jennings considered my request for a few moments, her expression thoughtful. In light of the nature of the incident and the domestic relationship between the parties, she announced, "This court orders the defendant to complete 6 months of community service and to enroll in a state-certified anger management program. Furthermore, I am issuing a temporary restraining order, effective immediately. The defendant is prohibited from approaching within 100 yards of the victim's residence and person for a period of 90 days, at which time the order will be re-evaluated." Carly's lawyer began to protest, arguing the order was excessive in a family context, but Judge Jennings cut him off. "Domestic violence is no less serious because it occurs between family members. Counselor," she said, her tone firm. "On the contrary, that is often what makes it so insidious." As I was leaving the courtroom, feeling the first flicker of victory, I saw him, Andy. He was sitting on a bench in the very back row, his head down. He must have slipped in after the proceedings had started. Our eyes met for a fleeting, painful moment before he quickly looked away, standing up to meet Carly as she emerged into the hallway. I wanted to go to him to explain why I had to do this, to tell him about the terrible things I had discovered, but the wall between us was still too high. He was not ready to listen. Not yet. I returned home and added a copy of the restraining order to my growing case file. The folder was getting thicker, a tangible representation of the battle that was just beginning. 2 days later, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Andy's name. My heart leaped. "Mom," he said. His voice sounded different. It was thin, exhausted, almost unrecognizable. "We need to talk." We agreed to meet at a neutral location, a quiet coffee shop midway between my house and his friend's apartment. I arrived 15 minutes early, choosing a discreet table in a corner where we could have some privacy. When Andy walked in, my breath caught in my throat. He looked haggard. He was thinner, and there were dark, bruised-looking circles under his eyes. He was wearing a dark turtleneck sweater, which struck me as odd for a warm Miami afternoon. That single, out-of-place detail set off alarm bells in my mind. "Are you all right?" I asked as soon as he sat down, my voice laced with a concern I couldn't hide. "I'm dealing," he replied, avoiding my gaze, his attention fixed on the laminated menu as if it were the most interesting thing in the world. We ordered coffee, and an awkward, heavy silence settled between us. "The restraining order has complicated things," he finally said, staring into his cup. "We've been at Patty's for almost 2 weeks. Her couch is destroying my back, and I think her patience is wearing thin. Can you rent an apartment?" I suggested, keeping my voice neutral, non-accusatory. He let out another one of those bitter, humorless laughs. "With what money? My salary barely covers our bills as it is." "And Carly?" He hesitated, looking down at his hands. "Carly hasn't found a new job yet." He still believed her lie. This was my moment. I had to choose my words as carefully as a surgeon chooses a scalpel. One wrong move, and I could lose him completely. "Andy," I said gently, "if you are having financial difficulties, I can help you." He looked up, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Just you? What does that mean? Just me?" "It means I am worried about you, and I want to make sure you are taken care of," I said. "But my help comes with conditions." "What conditions?" he asked, his voice tight. "I want you to sit down with me and review your bank accounts. All of them. Your checking, your savings, your credit card statements, and especially your retirement fund." He frowned. "Why? What is this about?" Because I have reason to believe that you are not aware of your true financial situation, I said. He put his coffee cup down on the saucer with a loud clatter, spilling some of the dark liquid. What are you talking about? If this is another one of your attempts to turn me against Carly. It is not an attempt, I interrupted, my voice soft but firm. It is a request. A request based on facts I have uncovered. Andy, tell me, when was the last time you personally logged in and checked the balance of your retirement fund? His expression faltered. A flicker of doubt, of uncertainty, crossed his face. I don't know, he mumbled. A few months ago, maybe. I have it set up for automatic deposits. And what about withdrawals? I pressed gently. Have you authorized any large withdrawals recently? He went completely still. What withdrawals? I opened my purse and took out a folded sheet of paper. It was a copy of his retirement fund statement that Rick had obtained. I slid it across the table, turning it so he could read it. The document clearly showed 3 large withdrawals, totaling $40,000, made over the past 2 months. Andy picked up the paper, his hands trembling visibly. As he read, the color drained from his face, leaving his skin a pasty, ashen gray. This can't be right, he stammered. I never authorized this. I never would. There's more, I said gently. I pulled out the other documents from my purse. The credit card statements in his name, filled with purchases for expensive jewelry and designer clothes he had certainly never made. I showed him the proof of Carly's termination from her job. I showed him the printouts of her social media conversations. He sifted through the papers, his breathing growing shallow and rapid. How did you get all this? He whispered, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and disbelief. I hired a private investigator, I admitted. After Carly assaulted me, I knew something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. You investigated my wife? He asked, his voice rising in an octave of indignation. I investigated to protect my son, I replied firmly. And it seems my concerns were justified. Andy, Carly was fired 3 months ago. She has accumulated over $80,000 in debt. Some of it in your name. And she stole $40,000 from your retirement fund. That is a felony. He closed his eyes, taking several deep, shuddering breaths. When he opened them again, they were filled with a chaotic storm of emotions: anger, confusion, fear, and finally, a dawning, terrible flicker of recognition. The bills, he said, his voice barely a whisper. She always told me she was taking care of the bills. There was always money missing at the end of the month. I thought we weren't managing well, that my salary wasn't enough. She was stealing from you, Andy, I said softly. He shook his head slowly, a man trying to deny the undeniable. No, there has to be an explanation. Maybe she was desperate after she lost her job. Maybe she didn't want to worry me. She must have been planning to pay it all back. Andy, I said, my voice filled with all the gentleness I could muster, there is one more thing you need to see. I handed him the last document, the screenshot of Carly's conversation with her friend, the one about the old lady biting the dust. He read the words once, twice, 3 times, as if his brain could not process their meaning, and then I saw it. I saw the exact moment his denial shattered. Something inside him broke. A single tear escaped from his eye and traced a path down his cheek. It was followed by another, and then another, until he was crying silently, his shoulders shaking. She always said, you didn't accept us because you were too old-fashioned, he choked out between sobs. She said that's why you were always so cold to us. Andy, I said, reaching across the table and taking his hand. I have never cared who you chose to love. I only care about how that person treats you. He wiped his eyes with a napkin. When we moved in, she said it was just temporary, just until we could save some money, but there was always something, some unexpected expense, an emergency. She said we were saving, but I never saw the accounts grow. My eyes drifted to the turtleneck he was wearing. And the sweater, Andy? It is far too warm today to be wearing a turtleneck. He went pale and instinctively pulled the collar up higher around his neck. It's nothing. My heart turned to ice. Is it her? I asked, my voice a low, dangerous whisper. Has she been violent with you too? His eyes filled with fresh tears. Slowly, hesitantly, he lowered the collar of the sweater. There, on the side of his neck, were the faint, yellowish-purple outlines of finger marks, bruises in the shape of a hand that had squeezed him with violent force. It was after the hearing, he whispered, his voice trembling so much I could barely hear him. She was furious about the restraining order. She said I should have defended her, she said. She said I chose you over her. He looked down, ashamed. I'm so scared, Mom. The anger that surged through me at that moment was a white-hot, primal rage. It was a mother's fury, a protective instinct so powerful it threatened to consume me, but I forced it down. Andy didn't need my rage. He needed my strength. He needed my clarity. I want you to come home with me, I said, my voice firm and unwavering. Today. Right now. Carly cannot come near the house because of the restraining order. You will be safe there. We will send someone to get your things later. The most important thing is to get you out of that situation immediately. She'll go crazy, he whispered. She'll lose her mind when she finds out I've left. That, my son, is exactly why you need to leave, I said. This is a classic, textbook pattern of domestic abuse, and it ends today. He sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the damning pile of documents on the table, the irrefutable proof of his wife's betrayal. Finally, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Okay, he whispered. Okay, let's go home. On the drive back to the house, Andy was silent, staring out the passenger window at the passing blur of the city. It was only when I had parked the car in the garage and turned off the engine that he spoke again. How did I let this happen? He asked, his voice hollow. How did I not see it? Abuse is rarely obvious at the start, I explained gently. It begins with small manipulations, tiny lies, little acts of control. They escalate so gradually that by the time you realize you're in danger, you're already caught in the middle of a spider's web. We walked into the house together, the house where he had grown up, the house that had always been his sanctuary. He stopped in the middle of the living room, looking around as if he were seeing it for the first time in years. I'm going to prepare your old room, I said, heading for the stairs. I had kept his childhood room just as it was, a time capsule of his youth. It was his refuge, and now he needed it more than ever. I changed the sheets, opened the windows to let in the fresh air, and placed a small vase of fresh flowers on his nightstand. Small gestures of love and welcome. When I came back downstairs, Andy was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at his cell phone with a look of dread. She's called 12 times, he said, his voice trembling. She sent 20 text messages, demanding to know where I am. You don't have to answer, I said. I have to, he replied. If I don't, she'll show up here, restraining order or not. He typed a brief, careful message. I need some time to think. I'm safe. Please don't look for me today. Seconds after he hit send, his phone began to ring, Carly's name flashing on the screen. He rejected the call with a shaking hand and then turned the device off completely. What do I do now? He asked, looking utterly lost. One step at a time, I said, sitting down beside him. First, we protect what's left of your finances. Tomorrow morning, we go to the bank. We change all your passwords, we report the fraudulent cards, and we notify them of the unauthorized transactions. Then, we go see a lawyer to discuss your legal options. Legal options? He repeated, the words tasting foreign in his mouth. You mean divorce? Among other things, I said. What she did, Andy, the unauthorized withdrawals, the fraudulent credit cards, those are financial crimes. You can choose whether or not to press charges, but we must take legal action to stop her from doing any more damage. He nodded slowly, the weight of it all settling upon him. I never thought this would be my life, he whispered. No one ever does, I said. That's how abuse thrives. It disguises itself as love. It makes the victim blame themselves. That night, for the first time in 6 months, we had a peaceful dinner. It was a quiet meal, but it was a comfortable silence, a silence not of tension, but of reflection and reconnection. Before he went up to bed, Andy hugged me, the first real hug he had given me in weeks. Thank you, he whispered into my shoulder. Thank you for not giving up on me. Never, I replied, holding him tight. Later that night, I could hear the muffled sound of him crying in his room. The sound broke my heart, but it was also a sound of relief. He was home, He was safe. And the tears were the beginning of the cure. The next day, we followed the plan. At the bank, the manager was horrified as Andy explained the situation, the documents I had brought providing undeniable proof. They immediately froze all the accounts, canceled the cards, and initiated a formal fraud investigation into the retirement fund withdrawals. In the afternoon, we met with Rebecca, a lawyer who specialized in family law and domestic abuse cases. She was a calm, compassionate woman with eyes that conveyed both kindness and a steely resolve. Based on this evidence, she explained after reviewing the case Carly folder, we have an exceptionally strong case for a divorce on the grounds of improper marital conduct. The financial abuse is meticulously documented, and with the evidence of physical abuse, we can petition the court for a permanent protective order. Andy took a deep breath. What if? What if I don't want her to go to jail for the fraud? I understand your hesitation, Rebecca said gently. We can focus initially on the divorce and securing your assets. The decision to file criminal charges can be a separate one, a decision you make when you feel ready. Leaving her office, Andy seemed both exhausted and profoundly relieved. It feels like I'm waking up from a long nightmare, he said as we drove home. That night, around 10 p.m., the nightmare returned. A loud, furious banging erupted at the front door. The doorbell began to ring incessantly. It's her, Andy whispered, his face pale with fear. She can't get in, I assured him, my voice calm as I reached for my phone. And she is violating a court order. I am calling the police. The banging grew louder, more frantic, as I spoke to the 911 operator. My daughter-in-law is violating a restraining order. She is trying to force her way into my house. We need a patrol car immediately, Andy. Carly's voice, muffled by the thick oak door, was a raw scream of fury. I know you're in there, you coward. Open this door right now. Andy shrank back on the sofa, trembling. I went to him, taking his hands in mine. It's all right. She cannot get to you. The police are on their way. The commotion attracted the attention of my neighbors. Lights flickered on in the houses across the street. When the patrol car arrived 7 minutes later, its flashing blue and red lights painting a chaotic scene on our quiet suburban street, Carly was still on the porch, now kicking at the door in a blind rage. We watched through the living room window as the police arrested her. She struggled, screaming Andy's name, her eyes locked on the house even as they placed her in the back of the patrol car. What's going to happen to her now? Andy asked, his voice barely audible. She will be arrested for violating the restraining order, I replied. This time, there will be serious consequences. The next morning, a detective from the domestic violence unit called. Carly was being held in custody until her bail hearing. Given the flagrant violation and her history, it was likely the judge would set strict conditions, if bail was granted at all. While Andy slept, exhausted from the trauma of the night before, I had another meeting with Rick. He looked grim. Ellie, we found more, he said, spreading a new set of documents across his desk. They were police records from 2 other cities, Atlanta and Dallas. She's done this before, Rick explained. 5 years ago in Atlanta, 3 years ago in Dallas. In both cases, she targeted financially stable, kind-hearted men. She moved in with them, systematically manipulated their finances, and the relationships ended with accusations of violence and fraud. What happened in those cases, I asked, a cold dread seeping into my bones. In the first case, the victim dropped the charges after she promised to change. In the second, there was a quiet, out-of-court settlement. He paid her a significant amount of money just to get her out of his life. She's a serial predator, I murmured, staring at the documented pattern of her deceit. And Andy was her latest target, Rick confirmed. And Ellie, there's something else. He hesitated. We found evidence that in the last few weeks, Carly was conducting online searches. She was researching life insurance policies and state inheritance laws, specifically how to secure inheritance rights through marriage. A shiver traced its way down my spine. The implication was clear, and it was terrifying. When I returned home, I sat Andy down and showed him everything. I watched as his face moved through a storm of emotions, shock, pain, rage, and finally, a cold, hard resolve. So I wasn't special, he said quietly. I was just convenient. You were a target, I corrected him softly. Predators like her are skilled at identifying good, trustworthy people. That afternoon we went back to Rebecca's office. Armed with the new evidence of Carly's past, Andy made a decision. He filed a petition for a contested divorce, and he filed formal criminal complaints for financial fraud and identity theft. "We will build a case so solid there is no room for escape," Rebecca assured us. At the bail hearing, Andy's determination was palpable. He wanted to be there. He needed to look her in the eye, armed with the full knowledge of her treachery. When they brought Carly into the courtroom, dressed in an orange jail uniform, she looked small and defeated. Her eyes found us, and for a moment, they softened when she saw Andy. But then she saw our hands clasped together, a united front, and her face contorted into a mask of pure hatred. The prosecutor presented the case masterfully, detailing the violation, the history of violence, and the new information about her past activities in other states. The judge, considering the overwhelming evidence of her being a flight risk and a danger to her victims, denied bail. Carly would remain in custody until her trial. As the officers led her away, she looked directly at Andy, her voice suddenly desperate. "Andy, please, don't let them do this. I love you. We can fix this." Andy did not flinch. He just held her gaze, his expression unreadable, until she was gone. In the hallway, he finally let go of my hand and took a deep, shuddering breath. "I thought that would be harder," he confessed. But all I could see were the lies. All of them. The trial was averted. Faced with the mountain of evidence against her, including testimony from her previous victims who had been located by Rick, Carly's lawyer proposed a plea deal. She would plead guilty to the financial crimes and the violation of the restraining order. In exchange, the assault charge would be reduced. The sentence would be 2 years in prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. The deal also included a no-contest divorce, in which she would waive any and all claims to Andy's assets or any future inheritance from me. "It's your decision, Andy," I told him. "It is justice without being revenge," he said. "After 2 days of careful consideration, I'll accept it. I just want this to be over." The final court hearing was a somber affair. Carly, thinner and paler, her vibrant defiance extinguished, stood before the judge and admitted her guilt. She was sentenced according to the terms of the agreement. As they led her away one last time, she turned and looked at us. "Andy," she called out, her voice a hoarse whisper. "I'm sorry. For everything." Andy did not reply. He simply held her gaze for a long moment, then gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, and looked away. It was not forgiveness, it was closure. It was the silent acknowledgement that a dark and painful chapter of his life was finally, truly, over. On the way home, we stopped at a hardware store. Andy had decided he wanted to repaint his room. It was a symbolic act, a cleansing of the past and a preparation for the future. He chose a soft, pale blue, the color of a clear sky after a violent storm has passed. The months that followed were a time of quiet rebuilding. The divorce was finalized quickly. The bank, with the aid of the criminal conviction, managed to recover a significant portion of the money Carly had stolen from Andy's retirement fund. Andy committed himself to therapy, working through the trauma of the abuse and slowly rediscovering the confident, joyful man he had been before Carly entered his life. He returned to his work at the veterinary clinic with a renewed sense of purpose. He started painting again, a passion he had abandoned years ago. Our home, once a place of tension and fear, became a sanctuary of peace and healing. We talked for hours, reconnecting in a way we hadn't since he was a boy. We healed not just our own wounds, but the wound that had grown between us. One afternoon, about a year after that terrible night, Andy came to me with a brochure. It was for a state conference on domestic violence, with a focus on recognizing and combating financial and emotional abuse. "They're looking for survivors to share their stories," he said, a nervous excitement in his eyes. I think I'm ready." On the day of the conference, I sat in the front row of the auditorium, my heart swelling with a pride so immense it felt like it might burst. Andy stepped up to the podium, no longer the broken, frightened man from the coffee shop, but a strong, resilient survivor. "My name is Andrew Miller," he began, his voice clear and steady, resonating through the large hall. "And I am here today to tell you how a broken glass of wine saved my life." For 40 minutes he held the audience captive. He spoke with raw vulnerability about the manipulation, the gaslighting, and the fear. He spoke with clear-eyed analysis about the patterns of abuse, the warning signs he had missed, and the systems that often fail victims. He spoke of the mother who refused to give up on him, who used the law not as a weapon of revenge, but as a shield of protection. When he finished, the entire room rose to their feet in a thunderous standing ovation. As I watched him, my son, transforming his pain into a powerful message of hope and advocacy, tears streamed down my face. They were not tears of sadness, but tears of overwhelming gratitude. The shattered glass had destroyed a family, but from those broken pieces, we had built something far stronger, far more resilient, and infinitely more precious. We had rebuilt our bond, founded now on a bedrock of honesty and unconditional love. We had taken the ugliest chapter of our lives and transformed it into a story of justice, healing, and ultimately, redemption. The silence in my house was once again a peaceful silence, the silence of a life that had weathered the storm and found its way back to the calm, sunlit shores of serenity.